Right, good morning. Welcome. Here we are at the second Sunday of January already. So there you go. Welcome to 2023, week 2. We're going to continue in Ecclesiastes. Last week we covered chapter 9, so what we'll do is kind of do a quick overview of the main points we hit there, and then we'll get into chapter 10 for this week. So with that. So if we think about some of the different things that we talked about last week, one of the things was we talked about how Solomon has used a lot of different places to talk about the certainty of physical death. And it's kind of made the statement, as long as there is life, there's hope, but death permanently closes the door to all activity. And we've seen this in different places. In this part last week, part of what he told us is that the certainty of death is the same for you, no matter if you're righteous or if you're wicked or if you're good or you're bad, if you're clean or you're unclean. So just kind of making the point that it's, no matter where you fall on the spectrum, we're all going to be in that same situation, that we can't control or avoid death, and that the same destiny overtakes us all. And he used an illustration there where he made the comment, it's better to be a live dog than a dead lion. And we talked about how in those times, in that context, how the lion was very revered and the dogs were essentially scavengers, not what we know today. But so his point there was that even the most despicable person who still possesses life is better off than the finest person who's already gone to the grave. So in short, he was giving us the message that life affords us opportunities that the dead cannot experience. Enjoy life and God's approval of your labors. And this is similar to thoughts that we have already seen. We've seen him talk about this in chapters 2, and chapter 3, and chapter 5, and chapter 8. And again, last week he said it again in chapter 9. Very similar things. And in this time he talks about, let's not focus on things that take away our joy, but let's focus more on things that will result in God's approval. And when we've got God's approval, then that subsequently leads to happiness. And you might remember we kind of use that phrase. It's kind of like he's saying in this section, have a blast while you last. So you may remember that. And then there was also a part of that where he talked about sharing that joy with our spouse, and that, the idea is that, we kind of help each other get through life together. Work hard as if it were your last work day. And he kind of made the point here that if the godly person realizes that God, one, first approves of their work, and then gives them this time to work. So it kind of gives a perspective on work that make the most of it while you can. Life is unpredictable under the sun. One event might change all of your best laid plans, and don't let the fact that we're all going to die, don't let that define us, don't let that dominate us, but enjoy life while we have it. And you remember we spent some time talking about how things don't always turn out the way that we think they will, or that we think logically they should. And he kind of gives some examples there where he talks about things like the fastest runner doesn't always win the race, the strongest don't always win the battle, that time and chance happen to everyone. And that's essentially, this is life under the sun. That's just kind of how it goes. And we sometimes think, well, that doesn't make any sense, or why would things turn out that way? But that's part of his point here, is that's life. That's how that works. And things are not always going to work out in some way that seems logical or that makes sense, or the way that you think that they're going to turn out. And that no matter how capable we are, that many things are beyond our control. And that kind of ties into the whole theme that Solomon's been using in a lot of different places, that he almost seems a little frustrated in places that he's got all this gift of wisdom, and he's trying to figure out all these things in the world and all the little nuances of life, and he's kind of come to the conclusion, it's like, even I can't do this. I maybe have all this blessing of extra wisdom that no other man has had before me, but even I can't figure this out. And he's kind of coming to that realization. So it kind of leaves us with the idea of put your faith in something that's not under the sun, or, earthly in perspective. And while we can't choose our moment of death, we don't let that impact us negatively, but we enjoy life while we have it. At the end there, we saw a story. He tells a story, in essence, kind of like a parable, of how wisdom prevailed, and he makes a couple of observations that wisdom is better than strength and weapons of war. If you remember the story, he tells a story about a powerful king who surrounds a small city with few people in it, and he builds these huge siege works against it. And so if you pause there at that point in the story, you think, well, this poor city, they're getting ready to get taken over, they're getting ready to run over, things don't look good for them. But in the story, he says that inside the city, there's a poor man, but the poor man was wise, and he saved the city by his wisdom. And so in the story, Solomon's trying to make the observation that wisdom's better than both strength and weapons of war, that wisdom is more effective for governing people than the brutal exercise of force and violence. And so, okay, that sounds good. And then he ends that section with a statement that basically talks about the impact of a single reckless, irresponsible person. And so he observes that a single mistake, a single reckless and irresponsible person can do a lot of damage and nullify the work of much wisdom, can do great damage over which the calculations of wisdom have no control. So while wisdom is better, he's still saying that, it's still possible to basically derail, maybe that's a better word, it's still possible to derail wisdom by a reckless act, by a sinful act. And it's kind of a warning to us, and that's going to roll into where we are in chapter 10. So with that, let's start chapter 10, and we'll start with the first 3 verses there. As dead flies give perfume a bad smell, so a little folly outweighs wisdom and honor. The heart of the wise inclines to the right, but the heart of the fool to the left. Even as fools walk along the road, they lack sense and show everyone how stupid they are. So we just kind of went through an overview of chapter 9 and how it's ending. We've seen how Solomon's been talking about obtaining and holding on to wisdom, but he also ended that whole section with a little warning to us that one sinner can destroy a lot of good. And he's conveying the idea that not only can wisdom be difficult to obtain when we're under the sun, but it can easily be ruined by foolish thoughts or foolish behavior. So even though we're starting a new chapter, these first 11 verses that we're going to go through are really a series of sayings and illustrations that Solomon's using to kind of further illustrate all the principles that he laid out for us last week in chapter 9. And so we see the phrase there, dead flies, and if you think about it, we've probably heard somebody say there's a fly in the ointment, and you kind of now understand where some of that saying probably came from. But the use of dead flies here is more literally, if we were translating it more literally, it'd be flies of death. And that just is used to kind of convey a much stronger emphasis than kind of looking at as, simply a fly fell into the perfume. And it's a good way of Solomon illustrating what we saw at the end of chapter 9, where he says, one sinner destroys much good. And the idea being that a jar of perfume that would be considered precious, expensive in this time, it can be ruined by the foreign influence of dead flies. And so what happens to that perfume once the dead flies get in there? It gets a bad smell. It's not valuable anymore, and it's not even really practical to use. What do you get? You don't get the value from the perfume anymore. You don't get the good fragrance or the good smell from the perfume. So he talks about how it ruins the whole thing. If you think about it from a New Testament perspective, Paul uses an example in 1 Corinthians 5:6 where he says, a little leaven leavens the whole lump of dough. And the application for us being that even the most righteous person can be ruined or destroyed by one sinful act. The respect and confidence of others, some would saying, blabbering here. One of the sayings that I saw when I was looking at some stuff for this is one person said, the respect and confidence of others are hung on the thin wire of reputation. And so we've seen that. We see that play out in a lot of different ways where someone can be well thought of and have a good reputation, but one mistake, one act can change that whole picture. And a lot of times it's impossible to recover from that. What kind of gets me here, it's interesting to consider that here's Solomon considered great in wisdom and honor, and yet we know from context that his foreign wives turned him to idol worship. And so you wonder, as Solomon's writing this, what is he thinking? Is he thinking about himself? Is it a reflection of maybe a lesson he's learned in his own life about how one bad influence can change a lot of things? Has he come to that point yet? And so, that concept is hopefully easier for us to understand. I was trying to think of a couple different things, and I thought about when I was in high school in chemistry class, we had a lab, and my wife is probably going to cringe at this, but we were done with the experiment, and we were supposed to put the unused chemicals back on the teacher's desk in the vat or whatever, the thing that was holding all the chemical stuff. And so I was cleaning up my lab area, and I grabbed my yellow chemical, whatever that was, and I didn't look real carefully, and I saw one that kind of looked yellow, and I just went over there and poured it in like I was supposed to do, except it wasn't the same thing. It was a different one. You remember the chemistry teacher's face? He was just looking at me like, you got to be kidding me. And because now it was of no use. I had ruined it. Another story about me. When we were first married, we had been invited to somebody's house for Thanksgiving, and we were supposed to be bringing the pumpkin pies. And so Tammy was making them, and I was helping. And she said, "Can you pass me the cinnamon?" And so I reached up and grabbed what I thought was cinnamon. Well, if you don't look at the cans real close, you'll notice that cinnamon and cumin look kind of the same. And so, trusting me, she dumped cumin we were mixing the pumpkin pie mix. And, once it went in, we kind of said, whoa, something's wrong here. And at that point, you can't salvage that. You can't pull that back out. You can't, it's just, where did you pour it? It's ruined. It's ruined everything. So one little, whatever that was, spoonful or teaspoon or whatever of cumin kind of ruined all the pumpkin pie stuff. So somebody, I won't say names, had to run out to Tom Thumb late at night and get some more stuff. But anyway, so you see things like that in our lives all the time, where it doesn't always take a lot of something to negate something much bigger or much larger. And so while we're kind of glad, as we've kind of watched Solomon go through this journey, we're glad that he's kind of starting to acknowledge more about God, and he's talking more about wisdom and things. He's also saying, but be aware. It doesn't take a whole lot to kind of derail this. It doesn't take a whole lot to ruin this. And so that's kind of the context he's using as we run in through here. Verse 2 associates good with the right and evil with the left. And that's probably not a concept that's necessarily anything new. If we go back through history, and we find that the pagans long believed that the right is synonymous with good luck and the left is synonymous with bad luck. And we see distinctions in the Bible, and we see stories where it talks about the sheep will be on my right hand and the goats on the left. We see descriptions of Jesus being at the right hand of God. And so we've seen kind of that illustration used for years and years and throughout history. Think about, sometimes we will say things like it's someone's heart is in the right place, or in other words, their heart's directing them toward doing what is right. I'm curious, I'm right-handed. Are there any left-handers in the audience today? I guess not, or they're not going to read. But I don't know if you remember this, but there was a time, but people always kind of looked at left-handers a little odd. And there was a time when they used to think that you were either sinister or shifty, or generally you couldn't be trusted because you were left-handed. And why is that? Well, because the majority of people are right-handed. So if you were different, must be something bad or something negative connected with that. And so he's kind of got the, he's using that same illustration where he's talking about the right and the left here in that scripture. So it's not a far stretch to see how things like wisdom and places of honor are associated with the right, while foolishness and things that are less important are associated with the left. I kind of like the way the Living Bible puts it. A wise man's heart leads him to do right, and a fool's heart leads him to do evil. That's kind of the thought. That's kind of what Solomon's trying to get across here in that verse. In verse 3, it's really kind of tied to verse 2, and it kind of conveys the idea that the fool shows no sense of direction. And that phrase, even as fools walk along the road, that's the idea of even in doing the simplest things, the simple things, the very basic things, that the fool lacks sense and gives evidence of being a fool. The Living Bible again. You can identify a fool just by the way he walks down the street. So the fool's actions confirm the fool's foolishness. And if we think about it, wisdom and foolishness really go in opposite directions. It's interesting, Solomon in Proverbs 17:12 talked about fools. He made a statement, better to meet a bear robbed of her cubs than a fool bent on folly. And so it kind of gives us some thoughts and some context and some idea of how Solomon views those who are foolish and trying to make the contrast with those who are seeking wisdom. Verses 4 through 7. If a ruler's anger rises against you, do not leave your post. Calmness can lay great offenses to rest. There is an evil I have seen under the sun, the sort of error that arises from a ruler. Fools are put in many high positions, while the rich occupy the low ones. I have seen slaves on horseback, while princes go on foot like slaves. So as we think about the whole book, and especially these last several chapters, Solomon has been trying to encourage us to embrace wisdom, that we live like people who are wise and that we pursue those things versus the foolish things or the folly. So kind of raises the question here, well, what happens if a ruler rises against us? And we see here in the NIV, it says if a ruler's anger. The word anger here, it might be translated mood in some of your versions, but the basic Hebrew meaning of the word is spirit. So what if there's something about those actions, that being, that person that rises against you, is in contrast to you, is in contrast to wisdom? And so what Solomon says is really, don't move from your position, your place. Don't change your outlook. Don't change your approach here. Because if you move from the position of wisdom, then the only alternative you've got is to follow the behavior of the fool. And so the challenge here becomes, how do we learn to live wisely with people who are unwise? And part of what he's telling us here is, well, don't lose your composure. Don't respond like a fool would respond. Keep your composure. Listen to your emotions without letting them direct your choices. So wisdom includes the power to make good choices, even during emotional situations. And so when we try to respond with wisdom, we're trying to respond under quiet control and use our composure to disarm their offense. And so we could probably make application of this to several different things where we're opposed to different things, and how are we going to act? And how we're, usually one of our first instincts is our emotions get the best of us, and we tend to want to respond in kind. But Solomon's saying if you're using wisdom, don't get distracted and leave wisdom to basically match them, fool for fool. But keep your composure and try to respond in a right way. Don't let them throw you off. And we could probably tell stories of things where people have won other people over, or the situation has been diffused. If you're not gonna get down the mud and wrestle with the pig, it's hard for the pig to wrestle by himself. And so, sometimes our best course is just keeping our composure, keeping our place, trying to respond with wisdom, and not get caught up in the emotion of that. Verse 5 starts an example of the foolishness of the ruler, and kind of paints a picture there of when power of the authority falls into the hands of the unwise. It talks about, well, when that happens, then errors start being committed, injustice reigns. In verses 6 and 7, he's trying to basically kind of emphasize that point, amplify that, if you will. Proverbs 19:10 is worded in a way that captures, I think, a lot of the sentiment of what he's trying to tell us in verses 6 and 7, where he says, it's not fitting for a fool to live in luxury, how much worse for a slave to rule over princes. One of the things that we'll notice about Solomon is he has a pretty black and white view of social order, and we see that in a lot of his sayings, where he certainly thinks there's a place for these different people in society and that they're in their place. And so he's using a lot of examples where he feels like those things get out of place, they get backwards, and he's saying that's the kind of chaos, that's what happens when a fool's in power, when a fool's in authority. The phrases there of fools are put in many high positions while the rich occupy the low ones, and slaves on horseback while princes go on foot like slaves. The rich there, it may mean literally the wealthy, but more than likely it's a little bit more symbolic and probably talking about those who are godly, or in this context, the godly people of Israel. And the idea is that when men don't follow the direction of wisdom, foolishness reigns and injustice permeates the entire society. And again, he's talked about several of these things throughout the book, where he's talked about injustices and different things, and he's kind of coming at it from a different angle this time. It's like, well, sometimes we just have the wrong people running things, and when we do, this is the kind of chaos that comes out of it. He's really kind of painting a picture here of the social order being out of joint as a result of having an incompetent ruler in place. It's kind of a picture of a helter-skelter, topsy-turvy world. It's the unhappy condition that prevails when incompetent people are in authority, and when they put equally incompetent people in places of authority, where the incompetent lord it over the ones who really ought to be in charge. And again, we can look at numerous examples around us of things where, we question, is that person really fit to be in that position? Should they be the one leading that? Should they be the one in authority? And we see some other people we think, I think they would be much better at that, or, why don't they get a chance to do that, or why aren't they given the opportunity? And so Solomon's kind of using that same example to make his point here. Again, logically, we would think fools might be limited to the places of low self-esteem, but, the reality is they're not. We see them in elected officials and civic leaders and school principals and company owners and company leaders. We see them in the ministry. We see them in religious organizations. So fools can have positions of authority in many, many types of situations. It's not one of those things where they're limited. I saw some stuff from a Dr. Kenneth Gangle that I wanted to read, that I think he's got a good way of kind of putting this together. It says, we certainly see things every day in our own country and around the world which make us wonder whether there is a great deal more of foolishness than wisdom in every human government. Maybe God just wants us to see how foolish we are and how useless it is to trust in the vanities of mankind under the sun. Perhaps he indeed waits for us to confess how futile it is for man to even try to govern himself, much less do anything that has any eternal value. And so, kind of in my mind, I read that and I thought that's kind of a good way to sum this up and sum up some of what we see every day. And again, this isn't Solomon's day. He's saying the same thing. I don't know if it gives us comfort or scares us, but the same kind of things have gone on throughout history. This is how he felt in his time. We probably feel the same in our time. And truthfully, I think probably through every generation, these same sentiments have existed. So it's nothing new. That's verses 8 through 11. Whoever digs a pit may fall into it. Whoever breaks through a wall may be bitten by a snake. Whoever quarries stones may be injured by them. Whoever splits logs may be endangered by them. If the axe is dull and its edge unsharpened, more strength is needed, but skill will bring success. If the snake bites before it's charmed, the charmer receives no fee. So in this section, he's giving us four more illustrations that continue to show how foolish it is to try and work without the aid of wisdom, or without putting things through kind of the filter of wisdom. And we try to figure out what he's getting at here, and I don't know that we always know, but the examples of digging a pit and breaking through a wall, they may indicate somebody's intention to do bad or to do evil. digging a pit to maybe try and trap another person or do them harm, maybe breaking through a wall to try and steal or take something for someone. So there's a couple of thoughts along those lines. If that's the case, if that's what he's getting at, obviously both of those examples would show a lack of wisdom, since if you were operating under the path of wisdom, you'd be seeking out righteousness and not trying to do bad or evil things. It may be more just the idea of you have to be careful of the consequences of your actions. If we think about it, one of the marks of the fool is that they don't consider the consequences of their actions and their decisions, and they fail to see the dangers. And so it could be that. It might be symbolism. Is it saying that the fool habitually digs a pit for someone else to fall into? What we might say, are they trying to set somebody up? Is that kind of what they do? And then invariably get hurt more than the victim. Is it the fool trying to take or get something from someone, tries to taking advantage of them or trying to use people and ends up getting bitten themselves? So there's probably 2 or 3 different ways we could look at this and try to kind of say what exactly is he getting. But I think the common thread you see through all of them is probably more that second idea, that there are consequences to our actions. And when you don't act with wisdom, when you don't give things forethought, things don't always turn out well. Now, when we get to the examples in verse 9, they don't necessarily suggest retribution like these first 2 examples have. But they really kind of seem to speak to accidents that may result from, everyday work, everyday things that we do when we're not wise about it, when we don't use wisdom. If we worked in a stone quarry, if we worked in a logging camp, it wouldn't take real long for us to look around and say, this could be dangerous work. I probably ought to pay attention to the safety regulations and those things. Have you ever been like on a small road sometimes and caught behind a logging truck? Those trucks, full of these huge logs and everything, and you're just like, I hope you guys strap those things down. I hope this guy in front of me knows how to drive this truck, because I don't picture anything good happening for this. One of these logs falls off, that truck goes sideways or something like that. There's probably not anything really good that's going to happen here. All I can see is kind of bad things, negative things. The idea of quarrying the stones or splitting the logs, maybe he's suggesting building something new, which of course you'd think wisdom would be a part of that to make sure it was a successful venture. He talks about the axe in verse 10. That could be a couple things. He could be simply talking about an axe by itself. He could be using that to symbolize elements or tools that we use when we work. And maybe the message is, if you don't prepare your tools properly for the task to be performed, it's going to make your job much harder. We've seen that. Sometimes it's the shortcut. It's like, well, I could do that, but and it ends up being a much harder job. If the saw is not sharpened, if things aren't tuned up, we think it's going to be faster, but in the long run, we work a lot harder trying to get the job done. The phrase is there, but skill will bring success, or wisdom has the advantage of giving success, or the advantage of skill is wisdom. You could also translate that as wisdom is profitable to direct. So it may take time to plan the work and sharpen the tools, but when you do that and you have some purposeful direction in what you're doing, it'll pay dividend in a couple ways, both in the energy it takes you to get the job done and the amount of work that you're able to accomplish. So it kind of, again, he's emphasizing the value of wisdom and how it makes things better. I was reading through this, it made me remember, you probably remember that old commercial, you can pay me now or you can pay me later. It was actually, I think it was a Fram oil filter commercial is what it was. But it's talking about, it may seem like a little bit of work now, but you'd probably rather pay me for an oil filter than pay me for an engine repair. And we apply that to a lot of different things where sometimes it seems like, I don't know if I have the time to do this, but if you look at it, there's a lot less time spent up front than if it goes bad, and what you'll spend on the back end. And so a lot of this is kind of the same thought on our lives. If you use wisdom to stuff, you'll prepare, you'll have the right tools, you'll have everything ready, and it's going to make the job a whole lot easier then if you think it's faster just to go ahead and jump into it without the planning, without the preparation, you're going to work a lot harder. It's going to take a lot more strength. It's going to take a lot more energy from you. Your job may not go near as well as it could have if you'd taken the time to prepare on the front end. So again, he's trying to give a lot of different illustrations to just show it's much better to live under the guidance of wisdom. It's much better to use wisdom in everything you do than to not. Verse 11 is another illustration of not using wisdom ahead of time or not thinking ahead. And in this example, wisdom says, if you're responsible for charming the snake, then employ the charmer to tame or control the snake before you display the snake. So why call in a snake charmer and pay them to charm the snake after it's already bitten someone or bitten you? Doesn't make any sense, does it? What wisdom is there in that? Could also mean if the snake charmer doesn't bother to practice their art before the snake bites, what good is their skill? The damage is already done, and charming the snake now won't create a different outcome for you. So again, maybe a couple different ways we could look at what he's trying to get across here, but the point is very similar in either application. It doesn't do a lot of good to look for counsel after you're already in the ditch. You know, Monday morning quarterbacking, I think we call it. Seek that counsel before you fall. And maybe at situations where we need the wisdom of a friend or an associate to tell us maybe some experiences, give us some advice on how to handle a would-be attack of the snake in our life. So if we make a parallel to that thing, again, are we planning? Are we doing the right things on the front end? Are we waiting till it's too late and it really doesn't make any sense? Why would why pay the snake charmer after the snake has already bitten you? Verses 12 through 15. Words from the mouth of the wise are gracious, but fools are consumed by their own lips. At the beginning their words are folly, at the end they are wicked madness, and fools multiply words. No one knows what is coming. Who can tell someone else what will happen after them? The toil of fools wearies them. They do not know the way to town. So this section begins with the idea that words from a wise man are gracious in contrast to the words that come from a fool. And it talks about fools are consumed by their own lips. So in other words, the lips of a fool bring about their own undoing. And the words of a fool, not only can they destroy other people, but they can consume the fool himself. And who typically suffers the most or has the most consequences in the life of a fool? Usually the fool himself. The fool can make other people miserable, but he's the one who is consumed. He's the one that utters the words that lead to his own suffering and a lot of times to his own demise. So it's not saying the fool can't cause you some issues or some troubles, but at the end of the day, the consequences for the fool are usually the harshest. It says the very beginning of the fool's conversation is foolishness. The beginning may sound like just jest and folly, but as it continues to go on before it ends, the words are characterized by the element of evil, and that's really what he's kind of getting at wicked madness. If you're from the Boston area, you might think of that as a different phrase, but that's what he's talking about here when he says wicked madness, the element of evil in there. He says fools multiply words. That may indicate that he's thinking about boasting about tomorrow or what they're going to accomplish or their own greatness or how important they are to society and how self-important they are. But when the fool speaks of tomorrow, they're talking about the thing they know the least about. And then he goes back again to that phrase, no one knows who's coming or what's coming. And he's said that many times already through the previous chapters. The word that's used for fool here in verse 14 means one who's dense, one who's a confused thinker. The word that he used for fool in chapter 12 is a little bit different. It means one who's possessed of an unwarranted self-confidence. But in general, when he talks about the fool, undoubtedly there's a mixture of both of those things involved in this person that he's talking about. What is coming and what will happen after them? These both refer to not only the immediate future, but the distant future, and maybe even as thinking about even after someone dies. No man can predict the events of tomorrow with any certainty, so how foolish is it to be boasting about what you're going to do in the distant future? And so it makes kind of the chattering, all the uttering of the fools even more pointless. It has no point. Verse 15, the toil or the work of the fool. We've seen earlier where we've talked about we know that God approves the work of the godly, but not of the evil person or of the fool. And, in essence, you've got a person that's working for nothing, and it's wearing them out. That's what he's saying here. They're wearied by it. It's an interesting phrase, they don't know the way to town. It's trying to kind of put across the idea of that the fool is so void of understanding that they don't know their way home. The activities of a fool are so exhausting that he loses his orientation. He has no idea where he's headed. And we might think about some phrases that we use where we might say, he doesn't know enough to come in out of the rain. That's the kind of idea he's trying to get across here when he says they don't know their way home, or they're so ignorant they can't tie their own shoelaces. That's the kind of idea he's trying to put across here with that phrase. It says he's foolish because he brags endlessly about his future success, yet his work is unproductive. And if he can't find his way home, how's he going to succeed in his plans? If he can't do the simple things, if he can't do the things that should be pretty straightforward for him, then how can he do all these other things that he says he's going to do, all these big plans and all these different things? If you think about it, the way to the city, the way to the home, that would have been one of the most familiar things a person would know. It would have been probably the best marked, the most traveled way, and yet saying the fool still can't find their way home. So again, another way for him to illustrate just how ignorant the fool is. Let's move on to 16. Woe to the land whose king was a servant and whose princes feast in the morning. Blessed is the land whose king is of noble birth and whose princes eat at a proper time, for strength and not for drunkenness. Through laziness the rafters sag, because of idle hands the house leaks. A feast is made for laughter, wine makes life merry, and money is the answer for everything. So if we look at verse 16 and we see that phrase, woe to the land whose king was a servant, when we look at the wording there, in some translations it may be translated lackey, but it's trying to give the idea of either a lad or youth, somebody who is young, which by extension would mean a servant or anyone who's in a subordinate position. And it's painting the picture of the land that's impoverished when the ruler behaves like a child or behaves like a servant, doesn't behave with wisdom, doesn't rule with wisdom. And says that, again, the picture then paints that this irresponsible behavior of the king is carrying over to the princes. And when it says dine in the morning, it's like, well, what does that mean? Is you're talking about, what time they eat? The implication there is it means that they're giving themselves over to a life of irresponsible carousing at all times. The whole implication of this is that it's a country that's ruled by a servant, that when a country is ruled by a servant, it's going to lose all sense of appropriate restraint and fall into a round of hedonistic merrymaking. So again, you kind of see Solomon's strong views on social order and different things, but he's making a point. He said, when you have a mature king, they act a certain way and things are done a certain way, but when you have an immature king, when you have a king that's not ruling wisely, here's how the king behaves. Here's the influence it is on the princes, and here's kind of what happens. Here's how people are living. Here's the chaos this is all creating when you're ruled in this situation. Now in 17, he provides a contrasting picture. Talks about a king that's mature in his behavior and of noble birth. Probably not only noble in his bloodline, but also in how they behave and how they hold themselves. Talks about these type of men are a blessing rather than a curse to the land. These wise men eat for strength and not for sensual enjoyment. They use the morning hours to judge wisely, not to selfishly pursue irresponsible carousing. And as a result, the land is blessed and happy. So again, a contrast between the immature king and the wise king or the noble king. Verse 18 transitions from the discussion about noble and honorable men back to the foolish rulers and the negative impact to the land resulting from their attitudes and actions. And he uses some illustrations here. He talks about the rafters and the house. And in this situation, it's probably, again, symbolic of the nation's state of affairs. That would fit more into the context. He's been talking about rulers and kings. So, they're going to live in palaces. They're going to live in different things. They're not going to live in situations where they have leaky roofs and rafters and that type of thing. So, in context of the time, you might say that Solomon's kingdom was bordering on the brink of rebellion. And if you think about what was going on, you had Rehoboam and Jeroboam both at this point kind of starting to eye his throne. And so again, this may be very reflective of what he's seeing in his own life. And he may be reflecting on some of his own mistakes and some of the things he's let happen under his rule. The word for laziness here carries the idea of much slothfulness. So it's not a light version of lazy. It's extremely, extremely lazy is what he's getting at. And so it's the idea of when those in control have little regard for their subjects, then things go unattended. Things don't get taken care of. And the house illustration he's using is, everybody would have understood that in his audience, the people reading this, that, first the rafters sag, and then that leads to breaches in the roof, and nobody fixed the rafters, nobody paid attention to that, nobody took care of those things, and now you've got roof leaks, and so the house is starting to deteriorate. And so the parallel being when those in authority are more concerned with their own personal pleasure than the welfare of the state, then the innocent suffer. Other people suffer. The kingdom starts falling apart. Verse 19 would seem to indicate that the three attitudes that he's been expressed here are the reason for the condition of the house in verse 18. So instead of repairing the issues, the officials seek a feast, wine, and money. Or in other words, they spend their time and energy in revelry rather than looking after the affairs of the state. It's a very interesting phrase there at the end of that where he says, money is the answer for everything. Kind of the idea, as you read through that and look at the language and some of the stuff that's going on here, it's really trying to kind of get the idea that people may throw themselves into feasting and drinking, but their overriding preoccupation is money, which among other uses pays the bills for all the carousing. So there's basically all the partying and all the rebel rousing and carousing and stuff going on, but they're really having to pay, really got to pay attention to the money part because that's what's funding all of these things. And you think about a lot of times in kingdoms, the way they were getting that funding was by taxing people. And so, again, we talk about when you don't rule wisely and when things are falling apart, how it impacts the innocent here. And so the burden of a lot of this is probably falling on the people within that kingdom. Let's go to the last verse, which kind of, there we go. Do not revile the king even in your thoughts, or curse the rich in your bedroom, because a bird in the sky may carry your words, and a bird on the wing may report what you say. So in this last verse, Solomon's giving advice or counsel to those who have been suffering through the abuse of leaders, whose character has been identified in the following verses. And he's saying, it's dangerous if you're going to react in an unwise way to the behavior of these leaders who are working contrary to God's will. So he's given the warning, don't revile, don't curse the king, don't do those things. And the word curse or revile here means speaking lightly of. Bird in the sky and bird on the wing is probably simply the idea that secrets have wings, that words spoken in confidence often find wings and fly to the ears of those spoken about. Today we might think of the phrase, well, how do you know that? Well, a little bird told me. And so you kind of see our modern version of that. If you think about that, how many times when people do things that are bad, do they find the need to tell somebody? It's like they seem to tell somebody, somebody's done something bad, somebody's done harm to somebody, and somehow they tell somebody, and the secret always comes out at some point. People don't keep those secrets. People tell their friends things in confidence sometimes, especially if you think about the high schoolers and that younger people, and the things that get passed around because you counted on somebody to keep a secret. We probably watch way too much true crime, but other than the fact that the husband always seems to be the guilty one, somewhere in there, somebody told somebody, yeah, I killed this person or I did this. And somewhere that always comes back and gets them. Things always get back. Now, that's not really what he's talking about here. It's kind of the thought process of, look, if you say these things, if you revile the king, if you curse the king, it's probably going to get back. That's not the way of wisdom. That's really not the way that you want to handle this. But be on guard against entertaining evil thoughts in your heart, because in an unguarded moment, those words may find their way through your lips to the ears of others. So kind of control those things, because you never know where that's going to, in a moment of weakness, in a moment of emotion, you may say something that you really didn't intend to say, and that may get back to the king, the words of others. I hear the band playing, so I think that means I'm supposed to get off the stage at this point. So anyway, that is all of chapter 10. Next week, Jim Corner is teaching. I think it's related to missions and the upcoming contribution in March and all of that. So we won't be here next week, but in the last 2 weeks, we'll cover chapter 11 and 12 and wrap up Ecclesiastes. So thank you for your attention, and we'll be back in Ecclesiastes in 2 weeks.